Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this session where we'll be trying to answer a question which increasing number of policymakers is asking, and that is whether and why we need to decentralize our economies away from a few hubs. With me to discuss this, we have three illustrious panelists. Starting with Rena, Dourou, who is the elected governor of the Attica region in Greece. She was previously a member of the Greek parliament, so she has both local and central experience. We have Teresa Lehmann, who is the Secretary of State for Industry in the government of Portugal, who's sort of quasi-host to this wonderful event. And we have Elisabeth Backteman, who is the State Secretary to the Minister of Rural Affairs of Sweden. And she's mainly tasked with rural affairs and indeed regional growth. So I would like to begin by giving each of you a couple of minutes to very quickly answer the question, why do we need to decentralize our economies? Rena, would you like to begin?
Thank you, dear John. I think that nowadays there are actually two major concerns about the future of our society. The first is the sustainable growth, and the second is the rising inequalities. There's not by chance that distinguished thinkers like the French economist Thomas Piketty have put forward in a very comprehensive way that the high level of current inequality in the West is reminiscent of situation of poverty and misery in the late 19th century. So I would say loud and clear that we must have no illusion. The kind of growth Europe has experienced during the 80s, 90s and the beginning of the 21st century relies upon a flawed model. It's a model creating inequalities based on structural problems such as the power of markets against politics. And you point out that I have the experience both, on the national level as well as local level, plus, my participation to the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities in the Council of Europe. And this is something for which we're talking a lot, in Strasbourg as well as Brussels. What I'm saying, this is the reason for which I'm here, is that in the era of new technologies, of new communication tools, it seems that we have to find or to invent new means of growth in a very inclusive way. And I think that this is the present goal for the future of regions. This is the present goals for states and international organization, and I would say that this is the goal of Europe, if Europe wants to be an agent of change, of progress and prosperity that people deserve today. In Brussels, the discussion, the argumentation from EU member states to EU of region has already started. And in order to have time, to discuss a little bit and try to answer to your question, I would like, to conclude with what we try, to end it up, and I think it gives us a yes to your question why we need to decentralize our economies. So, to everyone, I think that local and regional authorities can be a tool for a decentralization that we do need. And decentralization policies should be of a great importance against even the threats and the threats of xenophobia, racism, in which we have ended up because of the fiscal restriction or the measures of austerity the last year, especially in the countries of North. So if we do believe in the decentralization of our economy, I would say that local and regional authorities are a tool for an improved quality of governance because they are much more close to the local societies. They do know their proper needs, they do know their proper will, they do know their problems, and I think that it's it's a governance and a tool for better, stronger, efficient democratic institution. So on one hand, you have the markets, and you have countries like Greece that they cope, they tackle, with the debt crisis. On the other hand, you have the crisis of democracy, the devaluation of politics, especially for youngsters. And I will say that the answer to that is the decentralization of policies, especially for the youngsters, and the new technology. It's a power in order to give a convincing answer as well to the debt crisis and to the democracy crisis. So I would say that without any kind of flattery, this discussion is on the kernel of the Web Summit here in Lisbon, because we're talking for new technologies, but these new technologies cannot be neutral, cannot at the end of the day have only the commercial goals. And to be honest, I'm very proud that this is the second time that I'm a head of delegation of youngsters, that they do know that new technology can cope, for their own benefit, but they also, work in favor of their local societies.
Okay, thank you. Teresa, would you like to give us the view from Portugal?
Yes. First of all, good afternoon, everyone, and excuse my voice because I've been ill in the last few days. But I agree with Rena that it's really a matter of democracy, but it's also a matter of efficiency and growth. Decentralization honors the European principle of subsidiarity, but also sheer good management. Public and also an enabler of private growth. If we think carefully in the regions, the sources of wealth creation are themselves decentralized. Think about specialization and the way industrial clusters work, for example. So also decentralizing power and authority and the ability to make their own choices is also essential to accompany the forces of reality and how the economy works. So then adopting policies that are enablers of growth is really important and really implies decentralization. So if you look at EU countries, but even more broadly at the context of the OECD, the most prosperous countries, and there are several indicators to measure that, the most prosperous countries have implemented important decentralization systems with different layers, because it's very important that different areas correspond to different levels of decision. Because, for example, if you think about universities, it's normal that is more centralized, but if you come down and take education at a more basic level, is really important that is more decentralized. And we could be given more and more examples. But it's also a matter for the populations to feel identified with democratic principles and to feel empowered. But as I said before, it's corresponding to the principles of sheer good management. Take, for example, the case of Portugal. Although we are a medium country in European terms, we are a very open country. We are still a quite centralized country, but this government is taking important measures in terms of thinking seriously about decentralization. Fortunately, we are at a very prosperous stage of our economy. We have the best growth indicators in the last 17 years. But it's also very important that we accompany this dynamic also with empowering local and regional communities. For example, if you think about, I deal with industry, so with manufacturing, but more broadly speaking with industry. And then if you think about where our industrial clusters are located, they are a little bit scattered, but more in the north and south. But then we also want to take measures not to leave the centripetal forces of cumulative causation work and just reinforce, but also decentralize more. For example, I would like to give some brief examples of some areas in which some areas that are not traditional in terms of like regional industries, but we are trying to promote them. But also putting in evidence some endogenous resources. So for example, we have a very important inflow of foreign direct investment at the moment. And we have, for instance, 2 success cases in the interland. There's a municipality in the region in the interland in the center of Portugal around the town of Fundão. And we attracted several ICT investments in software development with foreign investors that also make the region more dynamic with small and medium firms and startups developing. And this was very important because also these companies cannot go just to the main cities of Lisbon and Porto. They also need to recruit the young parts of the population, and we need also to decentralize that. Also, the aerospatial cluster that we are developing in Alentejo in the south, in the southern hinterland, it's also an interesting case. So in all, I would think it as a matter of very important political relevance because of democracy, empowerment of the communities, but also really it makes a lot of sense from an economic point of view and from, of course, a point of view of social cohesion. And I suppose that later you may want to exploit more the technology side, and I think we can take it from there then.
Okay, thank you very much. And now for perspective from the north. Elisabeth?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah? Thank you very much, and I'm very happy for having the opportunity to be here and discuss this topic together with you. It's a topic of very high relevance, and in Sweden we have a very intensive discussion and debate for the moment on how can we keep the country together. We have had a really strong trend of urbanization going on for a very long time in Sweden. And how can we make sure that the country isn't teared apart in different bits and pieces, so to speak. And we are trying to focus from the Swedish government on the interdependency that we see between the country, the rural areas, and the urbanized areas, the big cities. And in Sweden, we're talking about mainly 3 big cities, like Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. And we know by experience that our companies, our enterprises, has been very successful in adapting and converting to new circumstances. And we have a strong tradition in that. So we are very sort of flexible, and we need to lean on that experience and that capacity when we are facing transformative phases like automatization, digitalization, etc. But I think it's not only a question on decentralizing power and economy from the national level to the regional level. I think we need to focus more on the interaction between the national level and the regional level as well. Because on a national level, there are some measures that needs to be taken and some policy decisions that needs to be taken. I'm thinking about infrastructure, roads, trains, railways, etc., but also infrastructure in terms of broadband. Sweden is a very long country. I don't know. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sweden is a very long country. I don't know if you're familiar with our geography, and we have a couple of bigger cities along the coastline, and then we have a huge inner land, so to speak. And how can we make sure that there is broadband in the whole of Sweden, which is, I mean, what people expect today to have. Ordinary people, entrepreneurs, the educational system, the schooling system are all dependent on broadband. So that's something that we can make sure from the national policy level. And we have the market that will take the broadband out in the country to some extent, but then we need national policy to make sure that the more sparsely populated areas can have access to broadband. That's one example of a national initiative that is very important. And then, of course, more general structural investments that needs to be done when it comes to the educational system and vocational training, for instance. And also the general climate for business development. And we're also working with a national strategy on regional growth. So these are some examples of what the national level needs to do. But then on the regional level, as has already been said here, the competence and the knowledge about the circumstances and the prerequisites on ground are better on the regional level. So therefore we need to have a strong regional leadership in order to make the right choices when it comes to specialization, for instance. And also I would like to see, and what we're trying to do in Sweden is how can we connect the policy area of regional growth with the policy area of rural affairs. I think there's a strong connection between them.
Okay, so thank you for that. Now I would like to move on to a slightly freer discussion. My first question, Anna Teresa, you mentioned clusters, and clusters is one of those terms that sort of goes in and out of fashion, and it's notorious, and as everybody knows, it's notoriously difficult to create clusters because they, especially from the top down, the most successful clusters that we know in the world, they sprang up from the bottom, around the Silicon Valley, around Boston, around Cambridge in Britain and Oxford in Britain, let's say so around Berlin maybe, indeed Stockholm for many startups. So these things are very hard to force, to will into existence. They sort of happen almost randomly. And there's this perennial chicken and egg problem, right? You can only draw investment and firms to come in once they feel that they have a qualified workforce, the infrastructure that is necessary, and suppliers with everything that they need. But those people, the workers, the suppliers and their infrastructure won't come until the firms, the businesses are in place. So how do you resolve this tension? What can governments do to try and bring clusters into existence without necessarily building them themselves?
You are right that clusters have been in and out of fashion since 1870, since Alfred Marshall. So this is all about externalities and really the critical mass then motivating all this dynamic. It's interesting because if you think carefully, most of the clusters that we now take for granted that were bottom-up, they were actually top-down in the 19th century, like some of the Italian industrial districts. So they are not so bottom-up, most of them, or even in Boston, etc., as it seems. What I think that is, but I totally agree with you that you cannot just impose or throw money at it and say, well, there's here a big multinational, then a cluster will miraculously spring out. No, of course not. What I think is crucial, and now fast forwarding from the 19th century to the 21st, if we want to stimulate a cluster right now, of course, there must be some ground on it. But what I think is more important is to have a considerable number of players that are seriously committed to work together. This is all about cooperation. This is all about common interests. It's not about philanthropy. It's about having end users, producers, suppliers, also science-based institutions, etc. So if you need a minimum ground for that. But sometimes not all clusters are equal as well. So it may very well happen that you must not have the pretension to have a cluster in 5 years, but it may very well happen, and I know some cases like that, that you don't have much, but you may, some types of activity can be attractive without a fully fledged network already in place. And then you have to create conditions that the linkages are stimulated, etc. If you think about startups, this is a more complex issue because the modern world of entrepreneurship is very urban. And if you think especially about more sophisticated tech activities, it's true that they tend to go towards the centripetal forces that the urban environments bring. This is a very natural phenomenon. But as I said, I think what is important is for you to look at the territory in terms of specialization. Not everyone, or in this case, every region, has to be a hub for tech startups. Like, for example, a very promising sector that I think even for Portugal and in Greece you are strong in that sector, but it's very important, for example, is the agro-food cluster. Or sometimes now you have agro-tech, etc. So in more rural areas, you can really develop an agricultural dynamic that is related to that. Now, for example, I know a lot of young farmers in the young generation that bring software to their farms. Like I have a cousin that is a sociologist that is in the south of Portugal in the aromatic herbs business, and I know lots and lots of them. So there's also a movement out of the cities, but more like specializing in other areas. If you think about other more peripheral areas, but they can be specialized, for example, in the textile or footwear industry. For example, in the case of Portugal, the textile industry and footwear industry are undergoing a boom, are increasing employment, which is unusual in Europe. You don't have a single country in Europe other than Portugal that this is happening. And look at, for example, the textile sector that is very concentrated in the north of Portugal. It's developing into tech textiles, for instance, technological textiles with very specific applications. But it's still confined to a sub-region that is very specific. So I think what we have to accept is that we cannot want to have everything everywhere or to force, as you said, some dynamics on some regions. But if the minimum ingredients are there, but I gave you an example of the south of Portugal, of Alentejo. There was nothing there related to aerospatial. And over time, just in a few years, we have already 3 major factories and a lot of small and medium enterprises. So we didn't create a decree to say there has to be their aerospatial cluster. I agree that doesn't work, but we created conditions so that it would make sense for companies that look for certain skills that were present in the region. So like the Brazilian company Embraer has already 2 factories there, very important French company components. There's a quite nice university there. So at the end of the day, it didn't exist 5 years ago, and now already a very interesting dynamic is existing there. So I think we have a mix of things. If you consider Marshallian industrial districts, I totally agree with you. This dynamics is a narrative of Italy in the 19th century, and this is more bottom-up than what I just described. Okay. But sometimes public policy can be very important and very instrumental. But you need to have players that want to do that. You cannot force this on them. And what is really interesting now, just to conclude, is also to look at it in novel ways. For example, not have the cluster like a textiles or footwear or aerospatial. It's like to have a concept. Like we have one on production technologies, and it integrates so many technologies, like from software to tools, to tooling and molds to machines. And so these actors got together with the users and the providers of the technologies to find turnkey projects and integrated solutions. And this has a value proposition that is totally different from the parts, and it brings more value added.
So I would like to be a little bit provocative here. A few weeks ago, The Economist put on its cover how to help left behind places, especially in the rich world. many, I mean, you mentioned centripetal forces that draw a lot of the most talented, the most go-getting individuals and companies to these big hubs, typically centered around large metropolitan areas. Perhaps it makes more sense to let these centripetal forces work, to let people move, to make it easier for people to leave those places which aren't doing so well and draw them to the places which are. Rena,
Yeah.
do you think that that would make sense, or is that...
I think that you're not provocative, though you are trying. I think that to a certain extent this is a triviality, and this is not offense for you. So actually allow me to share some remarks inspired but what from Anna and Elisabeth's intervention. The first remark is that we are talking about decentralization. We're not talking about an effort to dismantle the states. The second is that it's not a question of interaction between the national governments and the organization or the authorities that works in order to decentralize economies. I mean, up until now, it's obligatory to have interaction. What I'm saying is that when we are not talking about domain like foreign policy, the decentralization is much more effective, especially for the youngsters, start-uppers, for the entrepreneurs. And the third is that by this effort to decentralize, and help the local economy, I think that we ended up to be much more effective concerning the red tape, bureaucracy. The central government, it's much more bureaucratic. And so when we're talking about clusters, there's at least two exams that I have, in the region of Attica that are very, important because they have been implemented by the region and not by the central government. The first has to do with the tourism, and the second, it's a maritime clusters, 1,800,000 euros, and it's already there because the region and the organization and then the NGO that they help in order to implement, we're much more autonomous. So for me, we should not, be afraid of speaking for decentralization. This is not, a dismantle, of the state. And I think that we're going to help a lot fighting against red tape bureaucracy. And since we do not have a lot of time, I would like, to conclude by point out, stress, if you allow me, that decentralized economy brings, community development, and this is something for which we do need either, in North or in South, that promotes participative democracy, gives back credibility, to the youngsters, and of course to the entrepreneur and the investor. Many of the investors cannot trust, state and a centralized, bureaucratic economy, while it's not the same, with the decentralization authorities. And of course, we're talking about sustainable development, economic opportunity, and social justice. So, my dear Elisabeth, we're not afraid of decentralized economy, and I think that we must trust, this procedure.
Elisabeth, we only have 3.5 minutes left, but we're all citizens of the European Union. I'm Polish, so even when Britain leaves the European Union, I'll still be a citizen. But Sweden shares, a very long border with another European Union member and another very long border with a non-European Union member, but a very closely connected economy. So we often talk about regional development within the confines of a country. What about regional development across borders? Is there a case for regional policy that crosses borders?
Absolutely, and I think Sweden is a very good example. We have long borders towards Norway, which is not a EU member, but still we have Swedes going to Norway, commuting every day in order to work. We have a lot of Norwegians coming to Sweden in order to shop because it's much cheaper in Sweden than in Norway. So it's a fact that we have a lot of people crossing the border between Sweden and Norway on a daily basis. And we also have a lot of joint projects when it comes to regional development together with Norway. Another example is our southern part of Sweden, Skåne, which is very close to Denmark, and we also have a great number of people commuting between Denmark and Sweden every day in order to work. And we have a lot of Danes coming to Sweden, a number of Danes coming to Sweden in order to live, actually, to buy houses, etc. And then I would like to give a very nice example of how you can turn the map upside down. My minister, who's in charge of rural affairs and the green enterprises, he's from the very northern part of Sweden, and he succeeded in convincing IKEA, Mr. Ingvar Kamprad, to actually build an IKEA shop up in the northern part of Sweden. And his argument was that if you drew a line a number of kilometers outside Haparanda, you would get customers from Russia, you would get customers from Finland, you would get customers from Norway. And Mr. Kamprad, he was convinced that my minister was right, and they invested in an IKEA shop, which is a huge success. It attracts a lot of consumers from all these countries, and it's also a big employer in this area. So there are good examples of regional development across the borders. And I think we should not be afraid of having a more sort of open definition of what a region is.
And as we all know, Ingmar Kamprad is actually famously tight-fisted and penny-pinching, so he probably wouldn't put money where he doesn't think he could get a return. So
that's for sure.
So on that positive note, unfortunately we've run out of time. I'm sure we could go on talking about this for much, much longer. And perhaps some of you can go on talking about this for much longer during the forum. I would encourage you to try and nab our speakers. For the time being, thank you very much for listening in, and have an enjoyable rest of your day.
Thank you.